Hello again, everybody, and God be with you. Time for another story from Bob Hartman's More Bible Tales. This week's story is also from the Old Testament, and it involves the prophet Elijah. And this one is called Grandad's version. My granddad leaned back against the wall and looked at the ceiling. I suppose I've always been a fan of the underdog, he mused. I could feel a story coming on. I searched in vain for a way out, but Mum was making dinner and I had a pile of vegetables to chop, so I was stuck. When I was your age, young Malachi, I was sport mad, but it was always the underdog I supported, and I have no regrets. Oh, so what football team was it then? I asked. It seemed the polite thing to do, and the pile of veggies was huge. Football? He snorted. Football? Why, we didn't have those fancy schmancy footballs in my day, boy. Balls made of skin, stuffed and sewn together. You don't know how lucky you are. So what did you kick? I asked. Conies, boy. Rock badgers. We'd catch one of those critters, set him in the middle of the pitch, and see who could kick him to the other side. Sounds cruel to me, said my mum. Oh, so it was, replied Grandad. Those little beasties could bite. You'd put your boot in, well, but of course we didn't have boots in those days, just your bare feet. And the coney would clamp his teeth around your big toe. I can't describe the pain. Well, maybe if you hadn't been trying to kick them, I suggested. My point exactly, boy. The underdog, or rather the underconey. That's whose side I was on. So one day, when my mates were chasing one of the little critters, I swooped in, scooped him up off the ground, and just started running with him. And when I stumbled into the goal, everyone cheered and picked me up and hoisted me onto their shoulders. Because you'd saved the coney? Asked my mum. No, because I'd inadvertently invented a new way of playing the game. My mates were fed up with having their toes gnawed, so we changed the rules. And from that point on, you could either kick the coney or carry the coney. But didn't the conies just bite your thumbs instead of your toes? I asked. Well, you're getting ahead of me, boy, he scowled. Never get ahead of an old man and his story. Sorry. And yes, he continued, they did bite our thumbs, and that resulted in my final innovation, tossing the coney. It was a natural reaction at first. They'd chomp on your thumb, you'd chuck them in the air. But before long, conies were flying all over the field as a proper part of the game. And they liked that better than being kicked or carried? Asked my mum. Well, the flying, yes, Grandad smiled. You could see the expressions of delight and joy on their little coney faces. Then he shook his head. Oh, but the landing, not so much. Well, I'm glad we just kicked balls today, I said. And that we have water, added Grandad. Water? Said my mum. Yeah, that's right. In my day, there was a drought so bad that it didn't rain for 3 whole years. Dirt. That's all we had. Dirt plates and dirt spoons and dirt houses and dirt sandwiches. Or maybe they were made of sand. Oh, I forget. It was something we scraped off the ground. When was that, Grandad? Oh, the days of Elijah, he nodded. Those were the days of Elijah. He was a prophet, wasn't he? Said my mum. One of the best prophets Israel ever had, Grandad replied. In fact, they say that he was the one who stopped the rain. Well, God did it, I suppose, but it was Elijah who told evil King Ahab and even eviler Queen Jezebel that it was going to happen. Why were they evil? I asked. Because they got our people to stop worshipping the true God and to worship Baal instead. Baal? I said. That's right, Baal, Grandad nodded. It rhymes with pale, although some folks insist that it's actually Baal. which rhymes with, well, bull. It's confusing, really, but all you need to know is that he was some foreign fertility god. Fertility? I asked, and Grandad blushed. You'll have to ask your mum about that, he muttered. Mum looked at Grandad and shook her head, then said matter-of-factly, they believed he made the crops grow. I scratched my head. But I thought the true God of Israel did that. And so he does, boy, Grandad grinned. But in those days, the days of Elijah, there weren't many of us who believed that. So Elijah arranged a little competition between himself and the prophets of Baal to prove whose God was more powerful. And I'm sure you can guess whose side I was rooting for. The conies? I asked. No, the underdogs. Elijah. That's who I supported. Don't know where this fixation with conies came from, but you don't interrupt an old man in the middle of his story, boy. Now, where was I? Oh, yeah, 450. That's how many prophets of Baal there were, and only one Elijah. The competition was held at the top of Mount Carmel. Each side had a bull and a pile of wood. The bulls were killed and chopped up into pieces and placed on the wood. More animal cruelty, sighed my mum. And each side was given the chance to call on their God to send fire down from heaven and burn up the bulls. That sounds amazing, I gasped. Were you there? Everybody was there, Grandad beamed. But most of the people, my mates included, were supporting the Baals. They had big bees painted on their chests and waved bright Baal banners and even chanted their noisy Baal songs. I can remember it like it was yesterday. Baal, Baal, he can't fail. Or in the case of those who prefer the alternative pronunciation, Bull, Bull, he can't fall. Honestly, if you're going to worship a deity, you ought to be able to agree on how to say his name. But what did your mates do when they found out that you supported the God of Israel? I asked. What do you think? He sighed. They called me names. They laughed at me. They threw things at me. Things made of dirt, mostly. And conies? I suggested. Grandad scowled. You're making me sorry I brought that up, boy. But yes, there was the odd airborne coney. So I just stood off by myself, waving my little Go Jehovah flag. And then I caught Elijah's eye. Did he wave to you or anything? I asked. More than that, Grandad grinned. He came over to me. He thanked me for my support. He told me that there were hundreds just like me who supported him too, and that if we walked through the storm and kept our chins up high and weren't afraid of the dark and held hope in our hearts, that we would never walk alone. Never walk alone, said my mum, brushing a tear from her eye. That's very moving. So what happened? I said. Who won? You're getting ahead of me again, boy, Grandad muttered. This is a story worth telling one step at a time. The prophets of Baal went first. They must have won the coney toss, I chuckled. The prophets of Baal went first, he repeated, ignoring my remark. And they prayed to their God all morning, dancing around the bull. But nothing happened. Not a thing. So Elijah started to taunt them. Yeah, make fun of them. Maybe you need to shout louder, he suggested. Maybe Baal's deep in thought. Maybe he's busy. Maybe he's on holiday. Maybe he's gone for a wee. I bet that made your mates angry, I said. My mates? Oh, yeah, they were angry, all right. But that was nothing compared to the prophets of Baal. They grabbed their swords and spears and started cutting themselves. They shouted louder and louder. There was noise and there was blood. And I think that's enough, Dad, suggested my mum. We get the idea. All right then, he sighed. Yeah, I was just painting a picture for the boy. It's not like we saw intestines or anything. Dad, or spleens, he muttered. All right, it was messy. We'll leave it at that. The point is that nothing happened. Baal didn't answer. So Elijah told everyone to come to him. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, and repaired an old altar to God that had been broken down. He put the wood and the bull pieces on the altar, and then he dug a trench around the altar. A trench? I said, what for? Grandad chuckled. You won't believe it. My mates didn't, that's for sure. He told someone to fill 4 big jars of water and dump them on the bull and on the wood. The wood that was supposed to catch fire? I asked. That's right, Grandad nodded. And all that water in a drought, added my mum. What a waste! Grandad nodded again. And what a risk! You could hear the people moaning. So what did Elijah do? I asked. The same thing again, Grandad answered. More jugs, more waters, and then he did it a third time. And there was so much water on the altar that it ran down and filled up the trench. Now it was my mates who were laughing. There was no way that mess was going to catch fire, and they knew it. But Elijah didn't seem bothered at all. He stepped forward, he looked to heaven, and he prayed. Lord of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, show these people that you are the true God. Answer my prayer so that they will turn back to you. And then, I said, then what happened? Then he winked at me, boy, me and my little Go Jehovah flag. And before I could wave back or anything, fire fell from heaven. Fire so hot and so fierce that it burned up the bull and the wood and the stones and the soil and every bit of water in that trench. Wow! And what did your friends do? They fell on their faces with everybody else on that mountain and cried, The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God! Well, everybody but the 450 prophets of Baal. They thought it might be a good time to exit the pitch. So they got away? Nah, the people hunted them down and killed them all. Bit extreme, said my mum. It was a different era, Grandad shrugged. Relegation hadn't been invented then. Well, thanks for the story, said my mum. And you can stay for dinner if you like. Much appreciated, Grandad replied, but I need to stretch my legs. Then he turned to me. I wouldn't mind a bit of that turnip you've been chopping up, though. Sure, I said, and I tossed him a piece. But it's not cooked. Oh, it's not for me, he chuckled, and he reached into his pocket and pulled out a coney. Who's been a good boy, then? He cooed, stroked the coney under his chin, and here's a little treat for you. Then Grandad stood up. The coney nibbled on the turnip, and they walked out of the house. And the last thing I heard was, Ow! That's not a turnip, that's my thumb. I think somebody needs to do a little flying. Whee! I had to look it up to see what a coney was. And a coney is a rabbit. Big teeth. Well, there you are, the story of Elijah and how he won the competition against the prophets of Baal. There'll be another story next week. God bless.